Good afternoon. I'm Alex Thomson, I'm the Chief Executive of Localis. I'm delighted to welcome you all here today. Thank you for coming along in the middle of what I'm sure is a busy working week for you all. Particularly delighted to welcome our speaker, Rory Stewart. I have written down hot foot from the bear pit of PMQs, but I understand that he didn't quite manage to squeeze into the bear pit of PMQs, it being so full of bears. A little bit of housekeeping. Rory will talk for roughly 20 minutes and then we'll open up to Q&A, but we will be finished absolutely latest 2 p.m. And indeed before that if we run out of questions, but I'm sure you look like a question-packed audience to me. I should also say we're filming today's event and the video will be on our website soon, so please do point to any friends and colleagues who are unable to be here today in the direction of localis.org.uk. And if you are a member of the Twitterati, the hashtag for today's event is Localis Rory. You can see it's on the wall there, and possibly on this or on the back there somewhere. Also, there are a couple of seats at the front. Justin, if you want to come up and sit here. Don't think you have to stand. So, local democracy. If you're not familiar with Localis, we're a think tank. We've been around and pushing the cause for localism for well over a decade now. When we started, it was deeply unfashionable. Today, the profile of localism, pleasingly, is much higher. However, we were starting from the low point. The last few decades have seen sinking levels of political engagement. At the same time, there was, of course, a seemingly inexorable centralisation of power, and I can't help wondering if those two things are connected. If you don't think your voice can materially influence the things that matter to you, where you live, then you may well conclude that your energies would be better directed into other activities. The coalition government has, I believe, started to reverse this malign trend. There are millions of policies I could pour on all day, but you don't want to hear me do that. I'm a big fan of neighbourhood planning, I will mention, for instance. And the idea of city deals is a good one, though I would argue should be applied to the whole country. Some proposed measures, such as the introduction of elected mayors, have failed to capture the public imagination, but the concept that decisions are best made as close as possible to those affected is one that I think has growing currency across the political spectrum. Will it be enough to reignite the guttering flame of local democratic engagement, though? And with that question in mind, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today. Rory has a strong claim to having the most interesting CV in Parliament. In addition to being a successful author, he's been a soldier, he's been the governor of an Iraqi province, he's founded a charity, and he's been a professor at Harvard, which is enough for a couple of lifetimes, I would have thought. And now he has a well-earned reputation as one of the most thoughtful and erudite people on the political scene. And I'm therefore very much looking forward to hearing his thoughts on what, for me and us here at Localis, and you, I hope, is an absolutely crucial topic, the future of local democracy. So over to you, Rory.
Well, welcome. And since the theme of my talk is very much that the genius of Britain lies in the population, I'm very much hoping that this is going to be more about you talking than me talking. But just to begin by setting out a few principles. The first thing is that as a very new Member of Parliament, and I've only been a Member of Parliament now for just under 4 years, I have been very surprised by the extraordinary talent in Britain and our extraordinary inability to use it. And what do I mean by this? I mean that when I turn up in almost any village in Cumbria, I find myself looking at a place stuffed full, often of young retired people, recently retired telecoms engineers, or people who've retired from the army, or who may be school teachers from Manchester who bought a house in the Lake District, and they're pulsing with energy and thoughts, and they're able to pin me down and question every element of what's happening in relation to broadband policy. They can challenge me about exactly how a point-to-point microwave link operates, or they want to know exactly why we haven't adopted a cellular system, or what the upload speeds may or may not be on satellite. And at the same time, these people are devoting themselves day after day to running parish councils, to saving the local medieval library, to organising a sports day, or they're investing very heavily in their work with Amnesty or Save the Children, or they're volunteering as first responders, which is to say providing emergency medical aid, or they're volunteering in the mountain rescue on the mountainside. But the one thing they are not doing is getting involved in what we used to call politics, which is to say that almost none of them are members of political parties or would ever want to be a member of a political party. And indeed, if one ever suggests in any way that they might get involved in what we used to call politics, people respond with absolute abhorrence. I'm not a politician, I don't do politics, I don't want to be political. This is manifested in more and more eccentric ways. For example, campaign group 38 Degrees turned up to see me, and they sent emails to a lot of my constituents encouraging them to come and meet their MP to complain about what they call the gagging bill. So I suddenly find myself in my constituency surgery dealing with 52 people who I haven't seen before, all of whom have turned up at an instant at the same point and the same time to raise the same issues. And they are vigorously well informed, they've been reading the legislation, they have points to make about every detail of the legislation, they have constitutional theories. So when they're talking about the gagging bill, obviously they have things to say about freedom of speech, things to say about freedom of association. But the deepest single common theme is that none of them wish to be perceived as being engaged in politics. And this creates a problem. And it's a problem not just for us, but I think it's a problem going forward over the next 50, 100, 200 years. Because Britain is at the prow of history. We're at the front end of the boat of history. We were the first country to industrialize, first country to deindustrialize, and the kinds of problems that we are facing are problems that it's likely that many other countries in the developed world will soon encounter. What have we created? We have created, it seems to me, a society which exists on two levels. Either at the level of the very, very grand, which I can call to be provocative, the level of coffee Annan, or at the very, very private, behind your front door. And we have evacuated the space in between, which used to be the traditional space of the citizen, the politician, of normal politics, the sort of things that, if you were Aristotle, you would imagine a wealthy, educated population would get involved in. In fact, if you were Aristotle, you would look at Britain and you would think, this would be the ideal place for a vigorous democracy. We've never been so educated. We've never been so healthy. We've never had so many people with so much talent and so much to contribute. We've never traveled so much. I mean, it's a completely bewildering situation we find ourselves in. Under the surface, for example, of the Lake District villages that I represent, which, if you look at them from the outside, appear not to have changed since 1650. Indeed, I look outside my door and every house I can see in the landscape has been there since 1650. The map is identical. But if you were to go through those doors, you would find that 93% of the people in my local village, even in a very remote part of Cumbria, were not born in that village. And that behind those doors are aromatherapists, small businesses being run from laptops, an incredible plethora of consultants working for various different government agencies in and out, and a population that is rotating all the time. And in every meeting I'm in Cumbria now, I'm asking people if they'll stick up their hand if they haven't travelled outside the United Kingdom. And in the last 7 meetings, and these are meetings with upwards of 100 people, I have not had a single hand stuck up. Right? We're becoming a population which would have been unimaginable to our parents or our grandparents. It's a very different type of Britain. So, again, what are we doing with this? Kofi Annan, the first, and the private door, the second. So, the Kofi Annan problem. The Kofi Annan problem is the idea that what we should be doing with our lives, the meaning, the purpose, the justification of our political lives, is to get involved in the grandest and most abstract global projects. So it could be ending global poverty or ending global conflict. The classic example of this model of the world, and these are things that we might be filling in little envelopes, sending off checks to various international NGOs to pursue, campaigning on, sending emails on, talking about in secondary schools. The classic example of this is, of course, Kofi Annan himself. So if you were to look at Kofi Annan's current activities, he is a member of the Elders, which means that he is involved with 12 other people, and simultaneously, if you look at the website, they are solving the conflicts at the moment in Sri Lanka, in Cyprus, in Somalia, in North Korea, and in Israel, Palestine. At the same time, he is the president of the Jacques Chirac Foundation Committee in Paris. He's a director for the Center of Pluralism in Canada. He is a fellow at 2 different institutions in New York, one of them at Columbia University. He runs the African Green Initiative. He led the Kenyan Peace Process. He has collected 78 different honorary doctorates and prizes over the last few years, and he is, of course, also head of the Kofi Annan Foundation. And this phenomenon of the modern world is very interesting. So if there is a problem in Syria, what do? Well, you call up Kofi Annan, who's also simultaneously the Lee Kuan Yew Professor of Government at the National University of Singapore, simultaneously along with all these other things. And he will get on a plane for Singapore, and he will come to Syria, and he will propose a solution to the problem. This is a great ideal, but it is an ideal that represents, I think, without being mean about Kofi Annan, who I'm sure is a very splendid individual, but I think he's symbolic of a lack of seriousness. The idea that we kind of created a culture based on the preposterous idea that you can have a few global celebrities who are capable of flying into a highly complex situation on the basis of a week or 2 weeks or even 6 months on the ground, coming up with a solution where we would not imagine it would make sense. For example, in our own hometown, let's say I had a problem in Wigton with flooding. There was a problem with water overflowing in Wigton, relatively simple problem, something to do with water movement, water flow, drainage, heights of houses. Would I call in Kofi Annan? No. Even though it's quite a simple situation, I wouldn't call him in. If, on the other hand, I'm facing a situation based on the movement of 2 million refugees, highly complex sectarian and tribal affiliations, in a completely alien culture with a different language and a different context, nevertheless, I have this idea that somehow I can call him in. So a much more difficult situation, and a much more, unfortunately, I think, unconvincing trivial solution. The second element is the private door element. So we lurch from a fantasy that, and we see these fantasies all the time. I'm being mean to Kofi Annan, but the fantasy is carried through in every website, every TED talk, every Davos conference, every visit to see a West Coast philanthropist who's setting up a new global technology platform which is going to deliver microcredit to women in Bangladesh using a new mobile phone app, or some brilliant new concept to do with solar panels which is going to transform the lives of communities in sub-Saharan Africa. When we're not doing that, we're at the other extreme. We're locked inside our houses. So that many, many people of my generation, when you ask them why they're not involved in politics, will say, well, we're too busy. We're much busier than the previous generation. And what that seems to mean is they're busy, my experience, my friends, looking after their children. They're busy inside their houses, worrying about their children, right? They're worrying about, if I was going to be mean or create a cliche out of this, maybe they're cooking an organic meal. Maybe they're worrying about how to get their children into a particular school. Maybe they're fussing about whether or not they've succeeded in concentrating on some particular issue which I think if you were a 19th century man or woman might not seem a fully fulfilling purpose in your life. If you were Gladstone, you might think that some of these activities were not the activities to which you would wish to devote yourself. Right? In the middle then, between the front door and you filling in the check to encourage Kofi Annan to do whatever he's doing, is the whole space of being a citizen. And that's what's so extraordinary. we are somehow not using these people. My friends who are sitting fussing about their children, I suspect, don't really feel that that is a fully fulfilling life. I suspect they're doing it because they're not quite sure what else they can do. One of the things, for example, that's attracting people to the Scottish Nationalist Party at the moment, I noticed talking to youth activists, is they love the idea of being involved. They want to go out and campaign, they want to sit up all night smoking cigarettes and talking about big ideas, and they want to be canvassing, and they don't feel they're getting that anywhere. They don't feel they can do any of that stuff. It's the same, not just if you're a young person. I mean, a young person, maybe you can join the Scottish Nationalist Party and go around and lead your great crusade around the streets of Edinburgh, but it's the same if you're an older person. You're maybe 65, you're recently retired, you're full of ideas, you're full of energy, you really want to contribute to your society, you turn up in your village, and you're told that if you're lucky you can mow the lawn in front of the parish hall, or if you're very, very lucky you may be able to organise the pub quiz at 9 o'clock on Saturday night. And you come to your MP surgery and you say, I really want to get involved, I really, really want to do something for my society. So I say, okay, I'm going to put you in touch with a local charity. And the local charity essentially says, I'm sorry, we're oversubscribed, we don't have any more room for any more volunteers. And when you really push them on this, why? Well, it turns out that the modern world seems to be, in some odd way, too complicated. Turns out that if they were to take on this volunteer, they would have to follow a whole series of procedures. They'd have to make sure that they had a transparent hiring process. They'd have to ensure that they put them through the right training courses. They'd have to make sure that everything was set up in the right way before they could really use them. As a result, we have created this preposterous situation where we're all beginning to feel like superfluous individuals, right? Where we're generating more and more educated, healthy, energetic people who want to do something with their lives, who want to change the world, because that's what we're all told to do at school. And what we're actually setting ourselves up for is tragedy and disappointment. Every little child sitting there in primary and secondary school being told by their teachers and by their parents, you can be anything, you can change the world, you can go out there and be Nelson Mandela, you can be Gandhi, and they leave school and suddenly that opportunity is not presented to them. Right? What does this mean? Well, I would like to know from you what we do about this situation. And I would suggest that one of the things we might like to think about doing about this situation is local democracy. Tapping this energy by actually getting people to run their own communities. The one thing we know about young people or old people in communities is they know more, care more, can do more about local issues than a distant official sitting here in London or even perhaps in Brussels. They might be able to, for example, have a much better idea about exactly what kind of planning they want. They might have a better idea about exactly where they would like the local school to be supported, exactly how they'd like the bus route to operate, how the gritting should operate. And all that energy that's going at the moment, obviously, generally into single issue campaigns, into mountain rescue, into first responders, into the hospice at home movement, should be redirected towards taking responsibility for your own community and becoming, in a fuller sense, a citizen. Now, we have begun, and I've seen some quite encouraging signs in Cumbria that we're beginning to move in the right direction. And one of those is neighbourhood planning, which has been very exciting. We did a referendum on neighbourhood planning in Upper Eden. We were the first people to get it through, and it's been really revolutionary. It's been exhausting, it's been really difficult for the people who led it. Tom Wolfe, who did it, put 2.5 years of his life into getting this through. But finally we have a situation in which the communities have defined what kind of planning they want, and it's not NIMBY planning. They're very keen to encourage affordable housing, they're very keen to encourage barn conversions. They've managed to define exactly how many houses they want around each village, the rate at which they're to be built, the style of those houses, and now if you want to build in Upper Eden, instead of doing what you did in the past, which is going to Eden District Council and being told by the planner you can't do it, you now go to the planner in Eden District Council and they look at what the community have voted for in the referendum in order to determine whether or not you should get this form of house. Again, in broadband, and these are relatively trivial examples, but I want to give you a sense of this energy. We've succeeded in Fell End, where we thought we could never get any broadband access at all. 10 houses at the end of a 10-mile valley. We've managed to run fibre optic cables directly to each house, fibre to the premises, And we've done so because the community's taken responsibility, because the community has decided to dig their own trenches, to talk to every landowner to waive the way leaves, to sign up 90% of the community to take the services, and in doing so are able to go back to British Telecom and reduce the cost of the project from about £300,000 to about £17,000. And finally, and painfully, the government has stepped in and put in the £17,000 to bridge the gap, and we have a really good example of community, government, and private industry working together to deliver something that previously seemed impossible. But we're not really going to get there. We're not going to really tap this energy unless we begin to validate the role of being a citizen or a politician. Bring out its nobility, bring out its appeal. What I find depressing is that when I'm up in a market town, the top of the Pennines, and people are arguing about whether they should be sending off a proposal to the Heritage Lottery to restore the Methodist Church, or whether they should be working on the Wesleyan Chapel, or whether they should be raising $1 million for the Anglican Church, and whether they're going to convert everybody to gas and everybody to wood, and all these things happening within a market town of 750 people, so all these different agendas, all these different grant applications going forward to all these different foundations, and nobody in the centre taking responsibility, no French mayor, nobody standing up and saying, this is my plan, this is how much I'm going to tax you, these are the priorities, if you don't like it, vote me out. And when I propose this to communities, they say, oh, we don't want a dictator. Right? They don't want a dictator. This is an elected mayor we're talking about. Nevertheless, Britain has somehow developed a very, very disturbing, troubling love of a sort of amorphous, unaccountable civil society, of grants coming not from taxing the people in their market town, but actually from taxes on people who are buying lottery tickets being diverted through some very, very opaque system and allocated on the basis of the preferences of that lottery to these different churches. And in the middle of the whole thing, aren't the people pushing to shape their own environment, to shape the life they want for their children, to work out what our civilization is? So, I'm finishing on this because I'd like your views, but to conclude, the really big question here, there in Parliament, is what kind of civilization do we want over the next 200 or 300 years? What kind of country do we want to be? What's the point of educating us? What's the point of feeding us? What's the point of keeping us alive? And what's the point of our whole population? We're not doing anything with it. What we should be trying to do is create a civilization which intimidates our descendants. We want to create a civilization that people can look at and say, this is like Venice under the Doges. This is the Roman Republic. This was the Britain of the 21st century. This was a place where all this extraordinary investment in people turned into something, rather than that rather grim world that you go through, having been told that you can be Gandhi or Nelson Mandela, reaching the age of 18, applying for an internship in some MP's office, wandering around doing a little bit of photocopying, realizing that you're not actually changing the world, and ending up as a management consultant. Thank you all very much.
Oh no, I'm just I'll just shout. Thank you, that was fantastic. If you have a question, please stick up your hand. I'll take them in groups if there are groups, otherwise I'll just make some up. And if you can say who you are, where you're from, and try and be reasonably brief, that would be helpful. We've got Baroness Hannam and then one at the back as well.
Baroness Hannam from the House of Lords. Rory, I'm conscious of all that you've been talking about, that you haven't once mentioned the word representation. And the whole of democracy seems to me to be based on the fact that you elect somebody to represent you. Now, is that one of the holes that we've got ourselves stuck in, that we don't want to be represented, we don't like what the people are saying they're going to represent us about, and we actually don't agree when they represent us anyway?
I think that's... yeah.
Oh, do you want to do them one by one?
Well, no, we're happy to take two. Yes, take two. Yes, I'll take two at a time. Yeah.
Hi, Neil Johnston, Paddington Development Trust. Everything that you're describing, Rory, is happening up the road in North Westminster, where a group of a ward population is attempting to set up its own council. And I think that the issues that you're sort of outlining as opposed to detailing are complex. They're surrounded by uncertainty because there's no surety of tenure, so to speak, in achieving power and then being able to exercise it in a democratic context. And one of the key issues, and I'm sure it relates to Cambria too, is the whole nature of fiscal democracy, the democratization of capital, and without being a Trotskyist, that also involves the private sector, in that citizens are the state, and the state is citizens. Not that there are two things, as it were, one working on the other, but that there is a consciousness within a democratic population that it is responsible for and responsible to itself and the power that extends from this.
Right. Well, I think these two points are clearly related. But let me take them in reverse order. You're absolutely right. I mean, that central insight that citizens are the state and the state are the citizens is incredibly important. That statement, of course, reveals to us the fact that in most daily lives, as a matter of anthropology, as a matter of study, people don't feel like that. That isn't the way that people imagine their society. It's not the way they imagine the state. It's not the way they imagine themselves. And I think it is how they ought to imagine themselves, because I think Aristotle is right. I think we are political animals. I think we are most fulfilled, most satisfied when we are actively engaged in citizens in making the decisions on how resources should be distributed, what kind of civilization we want to be. And in order to encourage that, I think we need to create the constitutional structures to make that possible. The challenge facing any development trust, or indeed anybody trying to set itself up at the moment, is the extraordinary ambiguity around it. I mean, I can say to a market town in Cumbria, why don't you have a directly elected mayor? Let's try it, let's have a referendum, let's push it through. But the fact that the power that that person would have is so uncertain, the durability of it is so questionable, the terrible frustration that some communities experience, which is that they put all this time and energy into setting something up, and then find that in the end they meet obstacles that nobody had quite anticipated, which may be called 100 different things. They may be called state aid regulations, they may be called procurement regulations, they may simply be to do with what the Treasury will or will not permit you to do. They may be to do with various forms of special interest, specialists, expertise getting in the way. So I'm being very abstract, and this is stuff that you're very familiar with. But for people in the audience who aren't so familiar with it, just to give concrete examples, let's say you had decided to set yourself up as a broadband activist group in a small area. You would have begun with the feeling that you could organize yourselves, map out the fiber optic pattern, lay the fiber optic cable in the road, work out how to do it much cheaper, and then go to the government for some money in order to bridge the gap. And you would discover that there are any number of rules, and you would discover it quite late in the process, that actually prevent you from doing this. It would turn out, for example, that for the government to give you even a very small amount of money, for the government, for example, to give you £17,000 for 50 houses, an official would say that they would need to comply with European state aid regulations, and they would need state aid clearance from Brussels. You would then go back and say, how can this be true? Surely there's a de minimis clause, which means 17,000 isn't covered because it's under 500,000. And they would then explain that the company with whom you're operating, which is British Telecom, receives government money far in excess of 500,000, and therefore the de minimis clause doesn't apply, and you do need the state aid clearance. The next stage is you would then need to prove that 17,000, which in the end would have to go to British Telecom, had been run through a fully transparent procurement process. You would then have to go through a process laying out your request for bids. You'd have to show that all the other major telecoms companies had been given an opportunity to bid for this, even though you're saying all the time, this is ridiculous. I know the only people who can ever do this is BT. They're the only people who've got any fiber optic cable anywhere near here. Their exchange is the end of our valley, and Fujitsu doesn't have any presence in this county at all. Nevertheless, you would have to go through that full process. And you would think, month by month, that you'd finished. You'd think that you'd ticked every box, and every time there would be another box that you had failed to tick. And these very small sums of money wouldn't quite come. And eventually, after 2.5 years, you would begin to feel a bit ground down by the whole thing. You'd begin to feel that your rather small thing that you wanted to do was causing you enormous amounts of pain. So that, in a sense, leads into the baroness, because part of it is to do with clear constitutional principles. Part of it is working out how we can actually reform a whole series of different processes in government to actually make it genuinely satisfying to get involved at a local level. Because it cannot make sense for me to say to a young person, here is a heroic job for you to be a local councillor, this is your chance to transform your community, put your stamp on it, and over 40, 50 years, make your neighbourhood or village, you know, a beacon to the world, if it actually turns out that you can't really do anything, that all you have is a surrounding of officials, council officials saying to you this can't be done, of regulations saying this can't be done, so that things that you would have thought are quite trivial, you know, maybe you want to put up a statue of a local resident, something that in the 1860s you would have been able to do very, very rapidly, almost effortlessly, but would now turn out to be something that you'd be very lucky to be able to achieve in about 4 years. And you would achieve it at the end, having spent, and I've just been through this before I get on to the Baroness. Classic example of this, if you look at the way in which Britain's changing this, if you look at the anniversary of the Battle of Flodden. So Flodden happened in 1513. The town of Selkirk in 1813, the 300th anniversary, set up a statue of the suitor of Selkirk, a heroic Selkirk resident who fought at the Battle of Flodden, and this has become the icon or the symbol of the town. It's on every postcard, everybody wants to be photographed with it. That's the 300th anniversary. What happens for the 500th anniversary in a much, much wealthier country with huge resources at its disposal, determined to do something in Selkirk to really commemorate the 500th anniversary? The answer is they get as far as planting a small peace garden around the base of the statue at the end of a large process of community consultation, and at a cost, I believe, don't quote me, I may be wrong on this, but at a cost, I believe, of £100,000 for the construction of a small peace garden around the base of the statue. So there is a sort of weirdness going on, which is that if we're asking people to take on a heroic role, to transform and become, you know, 19th century civic leaders, there's a lot of stuff that would have to be Baroness asked the question about representation, which I think is very fundamental, and I think that also is a problem. There's a vicious cycle, which is that you do get this dreadful sense that part of British culture has become so alienated from the whole idea of politicians and politics. And we saw this with the mayors. I mean, I was stupefied. I assumed that after, you know, the jollity of Boris charging around in London, everybody would want a directly elected mayor. Instead of which, of course, what everybody said is, oh, we don't want more politicians, we don't want another layer of bureaucracy. And of course, as Simon Jenkins keeps pointing out, we have far fewer elected politicians in this country than any comparable country in the world. Right? We have something like 1/10 of the number of elected politicians that the French have, or the Germans have, or the Swedes have. We have very, very few elected people. But it seems somehow we want even fewer. So when I said to my father, he said, my father's now 92, and he asked me what I was doing today, and I said I was going to talk about local democracy. And his immediate response was, oh God, there we go. More politicians, more committees, more talking shop, just what we all need, right? Because somewhere in the back of his mind is some sort of fantasy of some technocratic state which we must fight against.
Yes, I would like to pick up directly on that. I admire very much what you've been saying. But there is a whole area of very strong activity going on. My name is Helen Marks, and I'm a trustee of Civic Voice, which rose phoenix-like from the ashes of the Civic Trust. It represents at the moment at least 270 civic societies up and down the country doing fantastic work. Unlike the people you described in Cumbria, they do come together. They do create trusts, proper registered trusts with the Charity Commission, and they are not single issue groups. groups. They cover a wide spectrum of things, and they really care about their societies, the places they live, I think, not just the civic society. It seems to me, having had quite a long experience of doing this sort of thing in my retirement, that the real problem, which you've also touched upon, is that it is the way politics has been driven lately, and it's become more and more ideologically hidebound. One of the things I say to our local Camden councillors, when they call us the usual suspects, and I say, well, if I'm a usual suspect, what does that make you? You've been a councillor for about 40 years, but somehow, because they're political. Now, this ties in with the fact that the political parties are losing membership. Our local societies in Camden have far more members than any of the political parties. And yet they still have the effrontery to denigrate us, you know, as if somehow, because we don't belong to their political party, what we say can't be worth very much. So as our colleague in Paddington there said, you know, it is very complex and very complicated, and I think possibly linked to what you said about such a sophisticated and now really relatively wealthy society. These kind of things, you know, do need thought. But I think also you have to go back to just human nature itself. You are always going to get people who, once they're given a route to power, grab it and stick with it and take it. And I fully empathise with the people who don't like the idea of a mayor. I think it's very alien to the whole British development, which you said at the beginning was the genius of the people. Not one person telling everybody else what to do, but the people. So there's a lot of complex issues there. And I would just like to sort of, you know, promote to you the idea that maybe civic societies and amenity groups, they don't have to be called civic societies, could be something. I mean, neighbourhood forums would tap into that, because it does give people an opportunity to develop that sort of thing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let me just take that very quickly, and then I'll take a group of questions together. I'm both attracted by what you're saying and also troubled by it. I do think that there is something to be said for a formal structure where somebody has been elected and you know who's really in charge, and people have had an opportunity to see a manifesto and vote on it and give their opinion.
Civic societies do that. They have a democratic structure and they elect their committees.
Yeah, but the great thing about a structure of parish or town councils, as opposed to some independent thing, is that it has a much, much clearer designated electorate, territory, group, where everybody is an elector, everybody theoretically should vote, and the reason they don't vote seems to be anyway, the reason why the turnouts in American local elections turn out to be 60–70%, whereas their turnout in presidential elections is so low, whereas in Britain it seems to be the other way around, is largely that we have stripped so much power from local government, that we haven't begun to give back as much power to local government as we should. And that as one begins to give more power to local government, it's much more likely that high quality people will want to stand, it's much more likely that people will want to vote, and it's much more likely that you, if you have a particular vision for your parish or your neighbourhood, can contest it in that transparent political way by standing up for election and saying, this is what we want to do, and if you don't like me, don't vote for me, and if you do, do. The problem with the current system is it's intensely opaque. I mean, just to give one example of this, which would be the environment. If you were to look at an upland farm in Cumbria, or what's happening throughout the Lake District, what you actually find is different groups, which could be called the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, could be called the Environment Agency, could be called Natural England, could be called the National Trust, all with different sorts of agendas, some of them stripping sheep from the fell sites, some of them planting woods, some of them re-employing people to create bird sanctuaries, and nowhere in the whole conversation is anybody trying to step back and provide an overall vision of what the plan for this whole area will be. What you're actually doing is you're being buffeted around with highly intelligent, highly articulate, highly confident people who feel very offended if you say to the RSPB, what you're doing may be fine from your point of view, but it's actually disastrous for the cultural traditions of this area, it's disastrous for the upland farmers. People feel very, very defensive. They don't want to be challenged in that way. They talk about their membership base. They say, If you're the National Trust, they would say, we have millions of members, what do you mean that you're challenging us in terms of what we're doing, in terms of sheep movement or farms on the hillside? But the only way I really find of addressing that is by forcing people to get into the traditional public realm of politics. Yes, I'm going to take straight to
my name is Tim Hall, I'm the County Councillor for Leatherhead in Surrey. Is one of the problems that we actually have a bureaucratic system now which is defending itself? In my town at the moment, we have a parking review which has 70 different maps going on for the district. And even I, knowing the town well, had to find certain bits of the maps all put back together. And at the same time, my district council produced on Tuesday 300-page greenbelt review. And the district council refused to engage with anybody, partly because they've been beaten up by the usual suspects from the community association, which I intend to try and still go out there. These are the problems that our bureaucracy now has got to the point where, frankly, it is killing people because 300 pages of greenbelt review is beyond anybody's sensible, as they are resigned.
John Barker, Corporation of London. I think one of the reasons people have stopped voting is because in fact, I agree with your father. I think we have too many layers of government. And of course, I've been on a Metropolitan Borough, on the London Borough, and now with the Corporation of London. So I was elected when I was 22. And I thought I could change the world. I realised I can't, and I'm almost at the end of the line. But when I started, there's a bit of pro bono. We got no allowances. And what I see now is this gaggle of politicians at all levels, all doing rather well. I mean, I've always had a real job. My politics was largely my hobby. I didn't expect anybody to pay me for doing it. And so now I see I'm surrounded, except in the City of London, I'm surrounded by London politicians who we have a local government dinner in Mansion House at the beginning of the year. And everyone there, apart from the Corporation of London, are in the gravy train. And I think this is the way they are seen by the voters. And I think people are so tired of this. There isn't the enthusiasm. You get the impression that, I'm sure that a lot of them go into local government because they don't do a real job. They collect their allowances. And so I think people have been turned off. So I would say that we need fewer politicians. We should pay them less, or perhaps not at all. And I mean, even your lot. Even your lot. I think I'm getting rather too much money. And I've recently involved with the noble lord, and of course he's getting his daily allowance as well. So get back to pro bono, and we might get some enthusiasm.
Thank you very much. Yep, I think this is very interesting, and I'm more interested in hearing you lot, so I'm going to go round. Yep.
Sorry, Matthew's Graham, local borough council, but my heart's in Cumberland with Newcastle. Tonight, I've got to go back and discuss chair meeting, community consultation, engagement, and involvement strategy. It goes against everything I believe in. Okay. I'm going to have a terribly difficult meeting because I'm a mother. I've been borough council now for 25 years. I started off thinking,
can we give you a microphone?
Oh, sorry.
We've sort of slightly given up on microphones. If people can speak. Actually, would you mind standing up?
Yes. No, sorry, start again.
Yeah.
Manny Brown, I'm a Melbourne Borough councillor,
yeah.
But my heart is, as I say, in Newcastle and Cumberland. And I've got to go back this evening to discuss community consultation, engagement and involvement strategy, which the officers of Melbourne Borough Council have come up with. And I've written, as you can see, all over it. I pretty well disagree with every single word it contains. When I was first elected, I was told I was a leader. I'm then told I was to serve. And I feel I am a servant more than a leader. But I just feel that I stood for an election with a direction of where I wanted to go. And if I knock on a door and say to somebody, they say, why did you do X? I don't think the focus group told me to. Is a very good answer. And I don't like to have your views, but I feel that we do consult, certainly in the time I've been there, that a lot of things Melbourne Borough Council has done which we've never got through, and this country will never have a wheelie if we consulted too much. So I'd just like your views to see where I am right and where I'm wrong.
Very good, thank you. Who's next? Just hand it to someone else with their hand up. Yeah. We'll get to everybody, don't worry.
I've really got to take you to task because you're so lucky, aren't you? You live in a place which is super. You actually have some, really interesting constituents who are beavering away, doing all sorts of things, which actually sort of either increase or reduce your post bag. So, I think there's a perspective here. I live in Hugh Robertson's constituency, and I joined the Conservative Party because this was a good way to see more of girls' needs, yes? And I think, in a sense, there are other ways now, really.
You could say that.
Totally correct. But there you go. There's a drive for membership, and it's interesting, isn't it, that membership has actually decreased for a long time. Now, in a sense, what are the components of this? And let me press you on this. I think the test is, can you shift your local medical service? And if you are in local government, as I am, hugely difficult. If you're an MP, and I'm sure you've had to go at various things, really difficult. So there are, as the last speaker said, there's a range of defensive bureaucracies across this country which are well entrenched and actually almost dynastic. You can't get into the BBC unless you're a Dimbleby or somebody else. Yeah, you can't leave, if you're a Dimbleby. So there's a clogging up of the system. And whilst I think there are things wrong with this, I think there is a cycle, and I think the tide is now out on politics, and it's in on single issues, because people perceive single issues, rightly or wrongly, as the things that are much more important than belonging to a group or a party. And the difficulty with politics and the hierarchical bureaucracies is that they can't shift the single issues. So unlocking the single issues may get you back into the democratic process.
Yeah, super. Thank you, Hannah. I'm afraid we're such a short contributions, but please contribute. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Alice. I work for Alice Woodhouse, and I work for the charity Age UK. And I just wondered how much engagement you have with older people in your constituency, because I think for the most part what you've talked about applies to younger people, but perhaps not for the older generation. I know you mentioned an over 65 rule, because I think I would probably argue that older people are very, very active in their communities, particularly in rural communities. They're often the primary sort of users of certain local services and also volunteers in their community.
Thank you. I'm usually attacked for attacking young people and championing old people. That's generally my shtick is that the older retired people are the heroes who are doing everything. That's the best.
Well, I'm really just one point though about volunteering though. I think it's true that a lot of people do want to volunteer and go to their local charity, but I think the issue isn't just with the too much bureaucracy. It's also volunteers aren't cost free. They cost a lot of money. Charities can't afford to pay to have volunteers for their training and upkeep. So
sure, absolutely, I agree too. Gentlemen, please stand up.
New category electoral reform services. Just briefly, I think we've heard lots about the issues of lack of citizen engagement, or citizen engagement not filtering its way up through the relevant channels. I wondered what your thoughts on practical innovations to democracy in terms of addressing this issue are.
Thank you very much. Gentleman there's been very patient.
Thank you. I'm Clive Josephine. I'm a retired management consultant, specialising in local partnership working. And before that, I was in local government, and I had another career before that. In your talk, you said, I think, virtually nothing about the role of politicians in this kind of vacuum you described, both at local government level and at Westminster. I'm interested to hear what role you think they should play, or whether they're actually an obstruction to this happening. In my experience of working locally, the best politicians, and it's absolutely intrinsic to success that had politicians on board, was that they were both supportive, had integrity, and values, but didn't try to ram everything, a set answer down people's throats. And just in response to something you were saying earlier, at Santos the motto is serve to lead.
Gentleman here.
As the councillor representing Sandhurst, that's probably a good cue. I'm very qualified to speak for old people and for people on the gravy train. On the question of the gravy train, I have to say that I have no conscience of this because I started off for free, so therefore I didn't think I went into it for that. But now as a portfolio holder, I get 23,000 a year. What I would say though, and I think it's worth saying, until that happened, I never ever had to face a selection committee at the ward level when there was elections. I was always the only fool willing to do it. Now we've got 40 candidates out there, and 4 or 5 will turn up at the selection committee because even if they're not a portfolio holder, there's 8,000 quid really for not doing a huge amount, to be honest. It does mean there's a wider variety of candidates. But again, to the lady from Age Concern, and at 79 I'm well able to speak for the old, one of our problems is there's a lot of older people now who are very skilled people, as you described, but when they've retired, they spend their time latching on to some thing like, are we going to have a pylon in our street or something? They're very erudite, but the huge mass of people who will not have any electricity in 20 years' time if none of these pylons are put in, their voice isn't heard, and I think that's where the elected members have to do that, and it's difficult to do, difficult decisions, but I needed to get those points.
Thank you. Super. Lady there.
Thank you. Erica Popperwell from CPRE. I'm quite new into the job, so my reflections so far on neighbourhood planning, which you raised at the beginning, which I think there's such potential there. We see loads of people getting really involved with it, and then getting really frustrated by the process with things being, companies coming in and managing to use vast budgets to lobby for their particular projects, or big decisions being escalated to ministerial levels. So it's all going really well, and then something gets in the way, and all that enthusiasm is lost. So what do we do to stop giving people the opportunity and then taking it away when it doesn't suit bigger agendas?
Okay. 3 more very quickly. 4 more. Please limit yourself to 20 seconds.
Thank you. I'm David Boyle from the Weather Institute and various other places. I just wonder if I speak as a Liberal Democrat when I say I think you make the mistake of many Liberals, which is to think that decision making is maybe the highest form of life for people, when it's actually the American civil rights lawyer Edgar Kahn tells the story about the National Legal Services Program, which he set up in the 60s to sue the government to enforce your own rights. And when it was closed down by Washington, they advertised widely over the country people to come forward to give evidence about why it shouldn't be closed. It should by then help 30 million people. Nobody came forward at all. And I think the lesson for that story, he says, and I think this is right, is that somehow passivity breeds passivity, and that the underpinning of the decision-making function is a generally more active, voluntary kind of people.
Super. Thank you.
I teach a master's programme in community organising at Queen Mary, and what that does is take politics to institutions and get people to work together and say, what are our issues? Put the issues on the table, and then hold the politicians accountable for their issues. So at pre-election time, just next door at the Central Hall, there was a big event where Boris Johnson, Ken Livingstone and so on turned up, and the people had their agenda that they put to the candidates. The candidates have to say yes or no. Will they support living wage, affordable housing, the issues? And that's absolutely electrifying, because it's the people's agenda, and the politicians are then asked what they think and then held accountable for it. And it's why Boris Johnson has turned into a fantastic champion of the living wage, which was kind of unexpected. So my point would be that it is possible, but there's a method to it. And community organising doesn't happen by accident. And what we're doing is trying to train organisers so they can take this methodology to institutions, and then you find there's a huge passion for politics. But there is a method, it doesn't happen automatically. So in a democracy we need to put resources into making these kind of independent relations, because the problem with localism is relying on the state, as someone said, the bureaucrats to reform the bureaucrats, and their vested interests are not to devolve power most of the time.
I'm many apologies to people who didn't manage to get in. I can see more hands here, but unfortunately we have only 2 minutes to go. However, I do think that was worthwhile getting everybody to speak, because I think what you have seen in that room, in this room, is the problem. Thanks. You have seen an incredible range of different. I began with this, right? We've never been so educated. We've never been so informed. So packed in this room are a whole series of highly experienced, energetic people, and all of you presumably combined by some interest in local democracy, and yet I've never seen so much disagreement. I mean, the range of different values, the range of different political positions, the range of different starting points, the range of different solutions proposed, the range of different allegiances, people who hold up community organizing as a model, people who hold up civic trust as a model, people who hold up development trusts as a model, people who hold up local councils as a model, people who reject the notion of paid politicians, people who embrace the notion of paid politicians, people who believe the ideal would be to present a menu to politicians and ask them to say yes or no to specific issues, and other people who say the most grisly thing about being a politician is having to do that kind of community consultation at all. Combined within this, right, is our problem, and this problem is called modernity. Right? It's to do with living in the 21st century. It is to do with the fact that we are no longer a uniform culture with uniform political beliefs. The views that are being expressed here draw on different political traditions. The traditions of Trotsky, traditions of Aristotle, the campaigns in the late 19th century for paid politicians, the belief in the 18th century of amateur politicians, of particular notions of public service, of ideas of community, rights, decision-making. Right? These are huge philosophical issues, and nobody in this room has actually managed to internalize fully, culturally, what our virtues are, what our values are, what our principles are, what our constitutional views are, what we actually think about elections, what we really think about parishes, whether we really think civil society organizations are or are not similar things to political parties or directly elected officials. These are so fundamental to our country. And yet somehow, if we are to come through the other end, we have to use the fact that this room is so full of experience. Every single one of you in different ways is campaigning, either with age concern for the old, or for civic trust, or for development trust, or in your local councils, all of you trying to shift and change your society. Other people in this room, think tanks, journalists, commentating on it, critiquing it, ministers. Somehow we have to get this conversation going and get some kind of sense out of it, because if we don't, none of our local communities will flourish. We will get stuck in a horrible kind of coagulated blancmange, a sort of mess of immersion and movement where the voices in this room, so diverse, so intelligent, so experienced, so various, will simply paralyze us, so that politics will become a shimmering performance, dancing between these different points, trying to placate them all simultaneously, giving a sense of difficult decisions and forward directions, when in fact going nowhere. Thank you very much indeed.